So when we look at the war in Ukraine, after all the craziness in Iran and the rest of the world, things might seem quite simple. But actually, some things don't really add up right now. Russia is taking some of the highest, if not highest ever losses of the entire war. Record numbers, month after month, day after day. And yet, simultaneously, we're also suddenly hearing rumblings that a deal to end this conflict could be close. So take a step back, and which is it? Is Russia collapsing under pressure? Or is this war quietly moving towards some kind of negotiated settlement? Because what's happening right now indicates something's much more complicated. Indeed, Russia may be bleeding at an unsustainable rate, let alone the state of the economy. But it's holding enough leverage, it seems, to shape how this war could end. Meanwhile, Ukraine, despite becoming more lethal than ever and triggering more and more blows to Russia internally, it still has some of its own limits. So in this video, I wanted to take a step back and probably break down what's been going on in the battlefield, why Ukraine's drone strategy is kind of changing everything, how this all connects directly to the return of negotiations, and of course, ultimately, what could happen next.
This is the Global Gambit.
How are you going, everyone? Welcome back to the show, here with a quick take, this time returning for the first time in quite a while of the war in Ukraine and Russia and the relationship to the battlefield, aside from Russia's economy. Now, we look at the strategy behind geopolitics, economics, and conflict, and we're particularly looking at the moment in this war about some things that feel contradictory on the surface, but actually reveal the deeper logic of where things are heading, especially for Putin, and in consideration of everything he's been benefiting, it seems at least, on the war in Iran. Now, let me know in the comments below what you guys think, and consider subscribing and punching that like button if you like what you hear. Now, let's start with some numbers, because they are striking. Ukraine claims that Russia has suffered over 35,000 casualties in just March. That's the highest monthly figure of this entire war. But more importantly, this isn't a one-off spike. March was nearly 30% higher than February, continuing a clear upward trend. But the most important detail isn't just the scale, it's the cause. Now, according to Ukrainian data, which we have to consider given the war, fog of war, informational warfare, roughly though, according to the Ukrainians, 96% of those losses have been caused by drones. Not artillery or tanks or more traditional, shall we say, drones. So that alone tells you something fundamental about how this war continues to shift and it's being fought. Really, take a second to process that, because tens of thousands of casualties in a single month are being driven not by sophisticated, heavy-duty machinery, but by relatively cheap, scalable systems, all largely built at home. So this isn't just a tactical adjustment, it's a transformational aspect to warfare in real time, and as we keep emphasizing, Ukraine is at the forefront. Now, we've seen versions of this before. In the First World War, machine guns and artillery completely reshaped the battlefield, making frontal assaults devastatingly costly. So what drones are doing now is very similar, making movement visible, predictable, and therefore extremely precarious. The difference is in scale and in cost. What once required these heavy industrial firepower and therefore production facilities as well can be done cheaply, mass-produced, and even in the back of people's garages. We've got plenty of illustrations of that happening on a continuous basis. Now, Ukraine is flying around 11,000 drone sorties per day. In March, they struck more than 150,000 targets, a 50% increase in just a month. And crucially, Ukraine appears to have gained a productive edge with an estimated 1.3 to 1 advantage in frontline FPV drones. So that matters because drones are now doing three things at once. One, increasing Russian casualties. Two, disrupting logistics deep behind the front line. And three, slowing Russian advances to a crawl. Not that they were exactly at sprints ready. Ukraine is striking supply depots, command centers, fuel infrastructure, and transport routes up to 120 kilometers behind Russian lines. That's not just there for defense, it's an active shaping of the battlefield beyond just the front lines. Think of it like this. Instead of just fighting the army in front of you, Ukraine is now targeting the entire system that keeps Russia's army functioning, albeit in the limited way that it was. And historically, that's how wars are often won. Not by destroying every unit on the front line, but by collapsing the system behind it. Most importantly, supply lines, logistics, communication, networks, and so on. But here's where the contradiction becomes a little bit interesting. Because despite these massive losses, Russia is capturing less territory than before as well. At its peak last year, Russian forces were taking roughly 10 to 15 square kilometers per day, which is not exactly much to write home about, but it's dropped even more to 5.5 now. At the same time, the cost of each gain is skyrocketing. In 2025, Russia lost about 120 soldiers per square kilometer captured. In 2026, that number has jumped to 300 plus. These numbers are extraordinary and difficult to really put into context relative to, say, Western levels. It's an extraordinary level of inefficiency. Russia still advances, but it's doing so more slowly than ever, more expensively, and in a way that looks just completely untenable. We've seen similar patterns in history as well. Late-stage offences where one side continues pushing forward, but at such a high cost that the gains become almost meaningless in strategic terms. So the obvious question becomes, how long can this realistically continue? And again, I'm curious what you guys think about this. How sustainable is this strategy? Could we, by the end of 2026, see for the first genuine time a moment where Putin has to come to the table because of the war being completely untenable for him and the political side, let alone the military? Now let's flip this round and look at something else, because for most of this war, Russia's key advantage has been manpower. But even that is starting to show signs of strain. Russia set a target of recruiting around 400,000 contract soldiers this year. That's roughly 1,120 recruits a day. Current estimates suggest, though, they're only reaching about 940. So that puts them on a track of a shortfall consisting around 65,000 troops. More importantly, though, Ukraine also believes that Russia hasn't been able to fully replace the losses it's incurred since December. And once losses exceed recruitment, well, you don't just stall, you begin to completely degrade. And that's without getting into things like morale, desertion, etc. And it gets even more complicated. Now, at this point, it would be easy to conclude that Russia is losing and Ukraine largely has the upper hand. And in principle, that would be right. But it's not actually necessarily the full story. Because despite these losses, Russia still has some deep structural advantages. Ukraine chips away at them, but they take time to occur. Russia retains access to a massive mobilization pool, potentially over 20 million people. That's more than half of the population of Ukraine now. So that doesn't mean it will mobilize them all, but it does mean it has a ability to choose from a level of people, a quantity that Ukraine just simply doesn't and never has really. At the same time, of course, the rising oil prices from the war with Iran have provided this windfall and helping to sustain war spending despite the growing pressure and alleviate Putin in areas such as paying salaries and cutting benefits and such. So even as Russia bleeds, it hasn't collapsed, and that distinction matters because that case of it perhaps being on a precipice of economic collapse is now being pushed back. All in all, this is what makes wars of attrition like this so difficult to interpret. High losses don't automatically mean defeat, and sometimes they just mean the war is entering yet another more brutal phase, although it's hard to see how much higher that can get in the case of the Russians. But it brings us back to the second half of this story that I mentioned at the beginning. Because while all of this is happening, Ukraine's top negotiator is now suggesting that a deal might actually not be far off. His argument, you see, is quite simple. Both sides, ironically or interestingly for the first time, including Putin, understand that this war may need to end drastically. Now that is a significant shift, especially from the Kremlin, because for most of this conflict, both sides, or more specifically Russia's, has been maximalist in their demands and unwilling to budge on them. Russia has demanded that more territory, Ukraine demanding the full restoration of its borders. Now, at least rhetorically, there are signs those positions may be beginning to soften. And I'm not going to get ahead of myself because, of course, we have been here before. And this isn't unusual historically. Wars often end not when one side wins outright. I can think of only a handful of cases like that. But when both sides realize that they can't achieve their original goals, regardless of whether they may be territorial, economic, strategic, whatever. For Ukraine, the pressure is clear. It remains heavily reliant on Western funding, which is increasingly facing challenges given Trump's comments over NATO. It faces that ongoing manpower constraint and is dealing with delays in critical financial support. Conversely, for Russia, the pressure is different, but incredibly significant too. War spending is enormous, deficits are widening, and the underlying economy is not tenable. As Budanov has put it, Russia is spending enormous sums, already in the trillions, and not something that a country that has its current economic construction can sustain. So both sides are feeling the weight of this war, just in their respective ways. And this is where the conflict starts to look less like a race to victory and more like a race to the bottom, or at least a negotiation over the limits, what each side can sustain and what they're also willing to accept. Now, despite the more optimistic tone, there, of course, isn't really much progress yet. It's early days and the world has been consumed by the war in Iran. The core issue remains, and I think will do, about territory. Russia wants Ukraine to withdraw from areas that it doesn't fully control, which is 4 oblasts. Ukraine wants to freeze the conflict effectively along the current line of contact. And the US in the past has floated alternative ideas like these economic exclusive zones or EEZs, but none of these really resolve the underlying disagreement. And given Trump's comments about NATO, his overall favoritism for Putin over Zelensky, it's not really a breakthrough. It's positioning and not one that I think Ukrainians can trust the White House over. So when you zoom out, therefore, and consider the strategic reality, the situation becomes much clearer. Ukraine has regained a degree of strategic initiative. It's preventing these large-scale Russian offensives and imposing insane costs. But it doesn't have the capacity to just decisively push Russia out either. So the war has entered a phase where tactical innovation is high, but strategic movement is limited, at least militarily. Politically, you are seeing efforts to push the boundaries, but the pressure is building on all sides. In other words, therefore, the battlefield and the negotiating table are even more linked than they were before. And it's more nuanced given these setbacks for Moscow, but also the relative wins, albeit relative in the case of Ukraine not having the support it needs in gaining greater leverage in the talk. So from here, therefore, where could this go? Well, there are different paths. You could see continued attrition, where the war can just grind on with the high losses, the limited gains, and nothing really changes for the next 6 months. Alternatively, you see some kind of frozen conflict, where the fighting really slows and the current lines become the de facto reality, and there's actually even less movement than there is already. Or, of course, thirdly, we see some genuine push towards negotiated settlement. Perhaps as we enter into the summer and the conditions for greater fighting occur, but both sides know that the war needs to end, perhaps if we don't see an upsurge in battlefield activity, then maybe that is a genuine effort by both sides to pursue talks. All in all, when you hear Russia is taking record losses and that peace talks may be close, those aren't contradictions, but they are, of course, all interlinked. Rising losses don't necessarily mean collapse, and more often they force Putin to do something that he never wanted to do, which is considered talking. Not because one side is winning decisively, but because Putin's own pressures at home are just too much for him to politically bear. And at the end of the day, if he can claim that he's protected the ethnic Russians or liberated the certain territories, then he can claim that that was what this SMO was all about. But ultimately, we know that that's a loss for the Russians. It's still too early to tell, but I wanted to make this quick video, this quick take, to get a sense of where we are, and we'll be coming back with Paul Walberg, Konstantin Samelyov, General Wesley Clark, and a lot of other new names coming onto the channel. So if you enjoy that, do subscribe, do like this video to help it in the algorithm, and check out this video on screen for some of the latest analysis about how this all bleeds into Iran, Russia, China, and more. See you soon.